Today is Thursday, November 3rd, 2011. My name is Mark Depew, the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. Today I'm in Elmhurst, and I'm about ready to start my interview here with former Speaker of the Illinois House, Lee Daniels. Good afternoon, sir.
How are you, Mark?
Good.
It's nice to have you in bright and sunny Elmhurst.
It is a bit of an overcast day. It rained all the way up.
It's rainy, windy, and you came all the way up from Springfield.
Well, there you go. But you've made that trip plenty of times in reverse.
32 years, and still counting.
Well, I learned something else coming in is about Elmhurst, as I mentioned before we started, and that's there's a lot of trains that go through town here.
97 a day. We are part of the transportation hub of the United States of America. One of the rail hubs, truck hubs, airport hubs, and we are a major transportation hub to this country, which not a lot of people focus on. They know about our airport, they know about trains, they know about trucks, but we are a major transportation hub right here in this area for the whole country.
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about Elmhurst or Chicago in general?
Well, Chicagoland is the recipient of that title.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started on your upbringing here. So if you can tell me when and where you were born to start with.
Well, I was actually born in Lansing, Michigan. Although I consider myself to be a lifetime resident of Elmhurst, the reason I take that title is I really didn't have much choice where I was born. My dad was a student at Michigan State, was then Michigan State College, and he and my mother were residents there. My dad going to school. He worked part-time with the campus police force, and he was chief of the Michigan State Campus Police when he graduated. And during the course of time, I was born in Lansing, Michigan, while he was a student there. I have a total of 7 siblings, 6 boys, 7 boys, 1 girl, and I was the I am the third child of my mother and father, and was happy to move back to Elmhurst after he got out of school.
Did you tell me your birthday already?
April 15th, 1942.
So you were born towards the beginning of the war.
I was, and my dad was drafted in, I think it was 43, joined the Navy, and served in the Navy until 45, till the conclusion of the war, and then returned to Elmhurst, where I lived in a little home behind my grandparents' home. It was actually considered to be the caretaker's quarters, but we were happy to have it because there was myself and 3 other of my siblings and my mother living in a 2-room house. And we didn't know the difference. We didn't have much, but we were like everybody else in the war. We were rationing all of our food products and gas and leather. Well, we didn't have a car, so it didn't much matter.
Oh, so while your dad was in the Navy, you guys moved back to Elmhurst.
That's correct. Right after he graduated, he had actually joined the FBI, and he was moving to Detroit, and he had checked with the draft board and said, you know, I have 3 kids and 1 on the way, and he said, if I join the FBI and move to Detroit, will I be drafted? They said, no, sir, you won't be. Well, he moved to Detroit, and he was drafted immediately. So he joined the Navy and as a 2nd lieutenant, and my mother and my brother and sister at that time moved back to Elmhurst. My grandfather lived in Elmhurst and had a very nice home, and behind that were the caretaker's quarters. It was literally a 2-room home. Was
this your paternal grandfather?
Yes.
Tell me your dad's name and your grandfather's name.
My dad's name is Albert L., or Bert, B-E-R-T, Daniels. My grandfather was Lee E. Daniels.
Do you know how the family ended up in the Elmhurst area to begin with?
Well, my grandmother, Alice Daly, was her maiden name, D-A-L-Y, grew up in LaGrange, and my grandfather grew up in, Lee E. Daniels grew up in Chicago. And they met and got married, and my grandmother had always enjoyed Elmhurst as a suburb and decided to buy a home in Elmhurst on Addison Street, and did so. And invited my grandfather to join her. If you knew my grandmother, you'd understand that. And of course, they moved to Elmhurst in 1929 and started our family here in Elmhurst. My father My father was a student here in Elmhurst, went to York High School, where I went to high school here in Elmhurst, and of course played football and basketball and baseball. He was quite an athlete in high school. He was 6'1" when he was a freshman, so he was a good-sized young man, and played at York and then went on to Michigan State. He started football, but it didn't suit him too well because those days they didn't have the face guards, and about the first day of practice somebody smashed his nose all over his face, and so much for his football career. So he went on to major in police administration at Michigan State. As I said earlier, joined the Navy, got out of the Navy, and then came back and went to law school at Chicago-Kent College of Law. He went to night school and worked as a claims adjuster during the day. So he started to practice law in 1950 here in Elmhurst. And my grandfather was the state's attorney of DuPage County at the time. My grandfather was state's attorney from 1940 until 1952. And at the time, they started a practice here in Elmhurst, and he also worked in a practice in Chicago, so he had two offices going. So, you know, I remember my father, who's now deceased, but I remember well, his work ethic was extremely engaging and very involved. He would work in one law office during the day and then come back here in Elmhurst and work here at night. And of course that's after going to night law school and working his way through law school. So we had the privilege of seeing him with a strong upbringing and had the same values for us. But having said all that, I didn't see much of him. So during my youth, my main influence was my mother at that time, because my father was either in the service or going to school or starting a law practice.
But still, I mean, typical of the 1950s, a large family.
Very large family, 8 kids. People always thought we were Catholic. In fact, we aren't. And they'd say, and I think at one point, if I remember the story correctly, the Catholic Church wanted to honor my mother and father as Catholic Mom and Dad of the Year. And they had to advise them that they weren't Catholic, so kind of respectfully, you know.
Well, with your father and grandfather, does that mean you're a third-generation lawyer?
I would be third-generation lawyer, that's right.
So what was in the cards right from the beginning for you?
Well, I had a pretty good idea that I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought about other things. I don't have the scientific acumen to be a doctor or necessarily a desire to be a doctor, although I admire the profession greatly. I thought about other activities, and to me the law presented a great many opportunities, whether it was being a trial lawyer or working on contracts or helping people. It just, to me, seemed to be the most noble career of all, because there's so many varieties and ways in which you can contribute to society. But it also afforded me to understand an ability to learn more about government, which I always enjoyed.
Well, it sounded like your grandfather was involved with government. Was your father as well?
No, my father didn't want anything to do with it. He thought all of us in public life were goofy. He said, why would you want to always be away from your family? Why would you always want to be subject to ridicule, always being in the papers in the negative way? And he just didn't hold public life as in much high value.
Did he see that because of what his father had experienced?
Well, I mean, my grandfather was Attorney General. In 1940, he was elected in a spirited primary here in DuPage County. Served in that position until '52. And then in '52, he ran for Attorney General of the state of Illinois and lost the primary to Lathan Castle. And in '56, he then ran for the Illinois House and was elected 3 terms in the Illinois House. So, you know, my grandfather's career was a good career, but yet my father would witness, you know, the various activities that go on in politics and didn't care for it at all.
I'm assuming your grandfather was a Republican.
Yes.
DuPage County at that time was solidly Republican?
Then, now, and forever will be.
At least that's your hope, huh?
Well, I mean, It's kind of a counterbalance to Chicago. I think if Chicago ever became more independent or had a spirited Republican Democrat, you might find the change here. One can argue that we've had more Democrat influence here, and that may be true because of the population growth. But I think for the most part, DuPage County will probably remain Republican for a long time. I don't say that in a partisan way. There's reason for that. And you know, we look at the school system. People are very proud of our school system here. Crime is low here. And we don't want to duplicate many of those things. And after all, in the end of the day, you have to look at the governing bodies to determine what you think about the government that they run.
You've talked quite a bit about your father. How about your mother?
My mother was the mainstay of the family, as so many cases in the 40s and 50s. I mean, they really held families together.
Her name?
Evelyn. Evelyn May Bousfield is her maiden name. She was also a York student. My mom and dad met at York High School. Women had to be very strong in those days because, as I said, my father went off to war. Who's taking care of the family? My mother. And who raised us? And basically, when you think about, generally speaking, who raises you? It's your mother. Now, your father has an influence, and I believe that the fatherly influence on a family is necessary. However, most interaction is with mothers. I mean, I have 5 children, and I got to tell you, I can't imagine taking sole responsibility for raising a family. And yet women do it day in and day out, not to take away from men. And I know today, in today's day and age, there's more men involved with raising families. But my mother was a major influence on framing and focusing the family. One thing we knew, that it took a lot to get my mother mad, but when she got mad, run for the hills, because it was going to be scary.
Does that mean she was the disciplinarian of the family?
Well, for many years, because my dad was gone.
Wondered if you can tell us a little bit about what Elmhurst was like. I mean, today it's very much a suburb, a bedroom community. It's in DuPage County, but I believe it's right on the border of Cook County.
That's correct.
So tell us what it was like in the 1950s and what growing up in Elmhurst was like then.
Well, people of my age have all seen Father Knows Best, and Dr. Marcus Welby, and all the little shows that talked about family life in the 50s. And you know, it was pretty good. You didn't have the same amount of stress, the same amount of difficulties that you have today. And one of the reasons is you didn't have the same level of technology or information going back and forth that you have today, or the same level of communication. As you know, if something happens in the world today, in a matter of seconds, it's all over the world. Well, it didn't happen there. You could have in the 50s, if there was a murder, you know, in a bordering town, you might not know about it for a week or so. Today, you'd know about it in a second, and there'd be a lot of news coverage on it. So Elmhurst was a great place to grow up. It was safe. It was conservative, and when I say conservative, I'm talking about in terms of family values, in terms of upbringing. It had a good work ethic. The town itself has a German heritage. And of course, being a suburb of Chicago, we have the advantages of having Chicago as a neighbor. Advantages such as employment and development of manufacturing base and so forth. Now today, there's been a shift because it's no longer just a bedroom community. For instance, right here in our town of Elmhurst, the 2 major institutions that help define this town are the hospital, which from where you're sitting is only 3 blocks away, the former hospital. 85 years was located in almost downtown Elmhurst, and as one of the major employers of DuPage County. The second institution that defines our town is Elmhurst College. Today it has a enrollment of close to 3,000 students, and of course is right by downtown Elmhurst. And so these 2 institutions, where our new hospital, Elmhurst Hospital, is opened up in the south part of town, a brand new spanking hospital we opened up in July 2011, has distinguished itself as one of the most state-of-the-art hospitals in the country today. All of these help define the kind of town we have, coupled with good schools, good people, conservative people, and I say that in a respectful sense, but also people that are committed to good family life and good upbringing and good quality government. So I consider it a privilege to have been brought up in this town, and many of the values that I share, hopefully good values, have all been a derivative of living in a town like Elmhurst.
When you were growing up, that was at the beginning of the time that interstate highways were being built. So was the commute downtown on trains?
Commute downtown was on trains. You could take the car, but it was slow. We didn't have what is today called the Eisenhower Expressway. In 1956, President Eisenhower created the toll road system in the United States, and of course that impacted a lot of east-west travel through here. As you know, 294 borders the property lines of the city of Elmhurst and connects us to the east-west corridor as well as O'Hare Field, and then the Eisenhower Expressway runs into Chicago from here.
Were there still some rural neighborhoods, still some farmland that was around the area?
Oh yeah, we had an airport here. It's called Elmhurst Airport, and in the 50s, small planes flew in and out of there, and Mitchell Field was O'Hare Field. And then the mayor of Chicago, then Mayor Daley the Elder, decided to annex some property in Bensonville and in the suburbs of Cook County, and created O'Hare Field. And in that process, they closed and they ordered Elmhurst Airport to be closed. The property was then sold to a developer who developed our industrial park, which is today our industrial park. And that's the north part of Elmhurst. But most people don't know about that at one time was an airport.
Who was the they that told you had to close your airport?
Federal government, because it interfered with the international airport, O'Hare Field.
I suspect there was some grumbling about that.
Oh, there was a lot of grumbling. I believe the first jet landed at O'Hare Field around 1956, commercial jet. And I can remember my father talking, and before that there were military planes flying out of that. And I can remember my father pointing up to the sky and saying, "There's a bomber, there's this, there's it," and he could identify the plane because, of course, he was in the Navy and had to identify many kinds of planes flying in the ocean when he was in the Navy. So he made a practice. But I can remember the landing of the first jet. It was very noisy.
How much the existence of O'Hare defines what Elmhurst is today?
Well, I think there are certain things that do define it. I said the hospital, the college. I think our transportation network, because we're 20 minutes from O'Hare Field today. We're 17 miles due west of Chicago. Now, in that 17 miles on the Eisenhower or Kennedy Expressway, it can take anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour and a half. So obviously you want to opt for the 20 minutes. Yesterday I had a meeting on a board that I serve on in downtown Chicago, and I timed it so that the meeting started at 1:30, but I got out of there by 3:30. Because the rule is if you get caught about 3:45, you're stuck for close to an hour. So these definitely define us, our ability to move products, move people, and to serve our community. We become part of the Chicagoland community.
When we met earlier, you mentioned that this area was known as Searsville.
Well, that was a nickname that was had because many of my residents worked at Sears, and they had a tendency to locate out here, ease of transportation, close to the airport, and not so much today, but in the 50s, they created a subdivision called Brynhaven here in Elmhurst, and an awful lot of Sears employees moved there. Also, you may remember, you may be too young for this, but you may remember the Sears catalog, and in the catalog you could buy a home, and it was called the Sears Homes.
Was there an advantage that you're in DuPage County and not in Cook County, that would be one reason that people would come here?
Tax structure would be one. That would be an advantage. And with all due respect, the level of crime is much lower in DuPage County, so that's an attraction to people. There are, generally speaking, better schools out here in this area. And you know, we are close to the necessary services that you want to provide, and you live in suburbia with basically tree-lined streets. I mean, we are one of the tree towns USA. And People, including myself, enjoy that aspect of. And here in Elmhurst and surrounding communities, you can walk the streets at night and not worry about your safety. I can't imagine being in a place where you have to worry about a gang warfare or problems of that nature, or being shot, or sending your kid off to school with the real risk that that child's going to be shot or some criminal activity is going to take place. Now, I'm not saying that this is a put down of large cities, because I think any large city has similar problems wherever it is. But it's a problem that we have to deal with better than we've done in the past. And I said we, I didn't say they.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the area was initially settled by Germans. What would be the demographics when you were growing up of Elmhurst area?
You're talking about in terms of ethnicity?
Yeah.
It was very much a German heritage. Elmhurst College, for instance, was had a heavy German influence.
Was that a Lutheran school?
It's a Lutheran school, but it's connected to the United Church of Christ now. It's affiliated with the UCC. And it had a great heritage, long-term heritage, and one that we're pretty proud of. But in terms of the influences, I think most of us didn't notice any necessary ethnicity in terms of our upbringing. I think the strength of character reflected a lot, but right now, today, it's a mixture.
You mentioned that the family was not Catholic.
Right.
Was the family religious? Did Mom get you to church?
She got us to church. I went to the Congregational Church. I was confirmed there. My youngest daughter is fourth generation member of the United Church of Christ, Congregational Church right here in Elmhurst on Kenilworth. We're not the best attendees today, but I was, in fact, not only did I go to church every Sunday, but also sang in the choir.
You roll your eyes.
Well, I'm not sure how good I was.
Well, you also mentioned when we first met something about a local swimming hole. I wonder if that swimming hole is still around.
Oh, no, it's long gone. That was Emery Manor, and it was on the north side of town by Lake Street. And when I grew up as a young boy, when my dad came back from the war, my grandfather had scraped up some money and bought a piece of property for him, and my dad built a home on it, which wasn't far from my grandfather's home. That was right alongside a cornfield. And if you went far enough into the cornfield, you saw a pond, and which we called our swimming hole. And of course, we owned it, right? That's what we thought. Until the Caterpillar tractor started rolling and leveling the cornfield and creating the Emery Manor subdivision, which were 2 or 3 bedroom homes with no basement on a concrete slab that were built right after the war. Destroyed our swimming hole, destroyed our skating rink, and made us very mad. We took revenge on Caterpillar tractors by throwing mud balls at them. Didn't get very far.
Was politics ever a topic of discussion when you were growing up?
Yeah, it was. As I said, my grandfather was state's attorney. When I was a young boy, he used to give us a quarter, and we'd walk precincts and pass out brochures to take them to the door and pass them out. Because he was also a precinct committee man, and at one point was the chairman of the Addison Township Republican committeeman. And he would give us a little stipend, enough to go to the penny candy store. And you know, we had unlimited energy, so we'd run door to door passing out the brochures.
So you broke into this business rather early.
About age 5, yeah.
Did you like doing that?
Yeah. For one thing, we liked being able to go to the penny candy store. Those of us that are old enough remember penny candy on strips, the little dots of sugar on a strip that you'd go and buy, give a penny, and you'd get like 2 feet of it. And of course, then you'd just eat the little dot. And of course, all it was is pure sugar.
By the time you got to high school, did you get involved in some extracurricular activities?
I did. I was a gymnast in high school, all through York, and for a year and a half at the University of Iowa. I played baseball early on in my youth. I was on the Little League team, the Bronco team, the Colt team, which are all divisions of baseball in my earlier years. I dropped out of baseball because the ball started coming in too fast. I didn't like that. So, and I was a vocalist.
Are you singing again?
I'm singing again. Here I am again. I started singing in 4th grade and started taking music lessons in 4th grade from my aunt, who was a music teacher. And I was then introduced to the Apollo Boys Choir, which was located in Florida. And my aunt had me audition for the director of the choir when they had a concert here in Elmhurst. And he pointed to a lady that was with him, the director, and said, "You take voice lessons from her for a year. I want to see you in a year." Her name was Bessie Ryan. Turned out to be my music teacher for quite a few years. And Bessie Ryan had a huge impact on my life and my career in music, and is somebody that I will remember my whole life, because she brought me a greater appreciation of music and voice. And so I trained under her, and then a year later, the director came back in town. He asked me to audition again. I did, and he invited me to join the choir, which was a boys' choir, Unchanged Voices. And my mom and dad said, "No way, we're not going to send you off to Florida." And they traveled the world, so it would have been quite an experience. I was pretty mad at the time. I don't know for sure why I was mad, but you know, if I look back on it, of course, that was probably the right decision.
Did you think at that time that maybe there was a future in singing?
You know, I never took voice so seriously that I saw myself being a careerist in it. I always thought that I found personal pleasure in singing. And so I continued studying under Bessie Ryan until about my 3rd year in high school. And actually, as my voice started to change, I auditioned in the University of Iowa for the music department, which you had to audition for, was admitted to it, and started practicing to find out they wanted about 4 hours a day. That's not something that I was interested in doing, so I dropped that and haven't sung since, other than when you have too many beers.
Well, in high school, it sounds like you're busy with the voice and singing and gymnastics.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of the two different groups
Well,
normally.
my
you think
voice
of.
teacher always wanted me to drop out of sports. She was always worried about hurting my voice, because I won the state 2 years in a row in Boys Unchanged Voices, and I guess at one time I was pretty good. So,
Which one would you have chosen if you had to pick one?
well, I think the voice definitely had a permanent impact on me. I think if I had to choose one or the other, I would have stuck with singing. But I chose not to. I wanted to do both.
But obviously, you must have been pretty good on the gymnastics as well.
I wasn't very good. You know, my brother was an All-American gymnast at Michigan State, but I wasn't very good. So.
But didn't you mention you got a scholarship at the University of Iowa?
No.
just-
What I mentioned is that I
Okay.
was a gymnast at the University of Iowa. No, I was not good enough to get a scholarship.
Okay. Did you have any jobs while you were in high school as well?
Yeah, I did. I pumped gas at the local gas station. In the summer, I worked, and the gas station, my junior and senior year in high school, I worked on Sundays and sometimes Saturdays. And then in the summer, I worked at Mount Emblem Cemetery cutting grass. It was an interesting job. And pumped gas.
Now, you've already kind of, we've had a peek into this, but your aspirations for a career beyond high school. Any questions that you'd be going to college?
None. There was no question. In fact, all of us were expected to go to college. And I really started defining my goals when I was in high school, and I really kind of wanted to be a lawyer. I explored other thoughts, but nothing really interested me. I mean, I did okay in biology, but I don't know, the study of plants and all that stuff wasn't really that exciting to me, zoology and the like. So I started defining the career of law because I found it fascinating and challenging.
What did you find fascinating about law?
I would say most importantly it's diversity and the fact that there are so many different aspects of law, from trial work to contractual work to health care to all kinds of different activities that I found most fascinating about it. And my father and my grandfather were lawyers, which I'm sure impacted my decision as well. Every once in a while they'd talk about a case and without using names because they were excuse me, they were very careful not to divulge any confidentiality in any discussion that I heard.
Did your father do a lot of trial work?
He did at one point, but towards the end it was mainly office work and office law. And he handled a lot of adoptions. In those days, doctors would call a lawyer and say, you know, I have a pregnant woman, she needs a lawyer to handle the adoption of her baby. Do you have anyone? And my dad had a very large adoption practice, took great pride in it, kept his fees low, and became very well known in the county as somebody that if you wanted to adopt a child, you should talk to Bert Daniels. And he did a real fine job in that. And in fact, recently I was in Michigan walking the street and somebody came up, are you Lee Daniels? I said, yes. I said, well, your father handled my adoption for my parents. And this young lady told me that she was adopted by a couple that had gone to my father, and it was kind of fun to hear that.
Yeah, that's really neat.
Yeah, but you know, today it's entirely different. You know, today it's handle a lot of agencies and so forth.
Did you grow up watching Perry Mason?
Oh yeah, sure.
Did you fashion yourself as the next great trial lawyer
No,
out there?
no, I'm not sure that I fashioned myself to be anything great.
Well, you've been very successful in Illinois politics, which we're leading up to here. Where'd you go to college?
Went to the University of Iowa. I was a Hawkeye, and I finished my required work in 3 years, 1960 and 1963. And my fourth year, I was a student at John Marshall Law School, and in that time you could transfer back your 30 hours to complete your degree because they were all elective hours. And I transferred them back and got my degree from Iowa in 1965.
So why does a kid from Elmhurst who apparently loves the town go all the way to the University of Iowa for school?
Isn't Elmhurst too close? You know, you still want to feel some of that personal grown-up responsibility in adulthood. And Iowa was perfect because it was only 4.5 hours away. And in those days you could hitchhike, and I could hitchhike back on the weekends, and did on many occasions. Had a girlfriend back here in Elmhurst. And many times would hitchhike back or forth, or even take the train on occasion. But several of my friends decided to go to Iowa, and a couple of them were gymnasts. So we went out there. We had a brand new gymnastics team, all new equipment with a new coach. And so we decided to go out there and start and help start the gymnastics team. And several of our York students followed us in years to come, and as a matter of fact contributed to some very good gymnastics at Iowa.
Did you like the community and the school?
Yes, I liked the school. To a great extent it was similar in nature to Elmhurst, although it was in the middle of a cornfield. And there was some adjustments because I used to listen to the radio in the morning that would wake me up for school, and it was always WLS and Dick Biondi and some of the old DJs, and they would be rapping in the morning. Well, the first morning at Iowa, it was the reports on the price for hogs and corn and beans, and I thought, oh man, I'm not going to make it here. It took a little adjusting, but once you got it, it's a good school, it's a fun school, and they deliver a good educational product.
If I'm correct, it was 1960 to 63 that you were there?
I was there 1960 to 63, transferred back 30 hours from John Marshall. So in 1965 I got my degree, but I had already then finished a year and a half of law school.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm not sure. you got your bachelor's degree at the same time you were at law school.
That's correct.
Okay.
They had an accelerated program.
And you were in a hurry?
I was in a hurry. Yeah.
I know also that, well, this is the time frame that there is a draft, that most kids are worrying about a draft. This is before the Vietnam buildup, but that's still got to be part of the equation, I would think.
Well, it never was. I come from a family that served in the military. My brother Rich, who works with me here in the office, was in the military police, and but I was at that age group where if you were in college, you were deferred. Then they eliminated that, but if you were married, you were deferred, and I was married. Then they eliminated that, but if you had a child, you were deferred, and I had a child. And then they stopped the draft. So I was always just at a point in my life where I was not part of the draft because of my status. I never intentionally did that. It just, that's how it worked out. I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I fell in love with a woman. I married the woman, and we had a baby. You know, not an unusual story in the 60s.
Well, especially in the early 60s, where
Right.
they were looking for reasons to give the deferments out because they couldn't afford to have everybody who was otherwise eligible in the military.
Right.
Did you do ROTC at
I
Iowa?
did. I was in, at Iowa, that was a requirement. I was in the Billy Mitchell Honor Drill Team and actually met governors at the airport in saber drawn, and the governors would walk under that, or distinguished dignitaries. We would be charged with meeting them at the airport in Iowa City. But, you know, that was not a real involved thing. I didn't sign up for the full ROTC course. That was a requirement that I took. I kept on telling one of my friends, you got to take this course. I'm not taking it. He'd say, you see, you got to take this course. You're not going to graduate. Sure enough, what happened? They eliminated the requirement. So I had taken the course. I didn't mind it, but you had to learn how to shine your shoes and put on a uniform.
When did you get married?
1962. I married my first wife, Suzanne. She was my high school sweetheart. And
What was her last name?
Burke, B-U-R-K-E. And she was a cute, or was, or what I guess was at the time, her age, a cute young girl, and we fell in love and decided to get married, and we got married, and then we decided to have children, because we then associated with a lot of people at Iowa that had children. And we lost our first two babies. Our first son passed away 26 hours after birth. And we went to the doctor, and the doctor said there's no reason why you can't have a child. And she got pregnant fairly quickly, and we lost our second child, who was born 36 hours after birth. He died. And the second child that passed away, I was then in law school. And then we decided to have another try. The doctors assured us there was no reason why there should be a normal birth and normal delivery. And our third child, Lori, was born, and Lori suffered brain damage shortly after birth, but survived. Today, Lori is 47, lives in Orland Park in what's called a SILA, Community Integrated Living Arrangement, with 3 other adult women, and she works 5 days a week, and I'm awful proud of her. She's mildly retarded and profoundly physically handicapped. She's confined to a wheelchair. Does a great job. She's a great young girl, but it was very tough. I was a freshman in law school and went through the loss of a second child, and then Lori was born a year after that. In fact, she's going to celebrate her 47th birthday, November 23rd. She's a great young girl.
Yeah, that's a lot of
Picture of Lori in the family picture there. She's sitting down.
Oh, okay. A lot of pain for a young couple to deal with then.
Tremendous pain, and without a doubt contributed to our ultimate divorce. But once again, I was so busy with school, and I worked during the day and went to night law school, that it really, a lot of the pain and suffering I had set aside myself, because that's how you could deal with it. But my wife, you know, had the then responsibility of raising our daughter.
When did the divorce come?
1969.
Okay. So you had already graduated from law school.
I had graduated law school in 1967. We had another daughter, Rachel. Rachel is married and has 3 daughters and lives with her husband in Orlando, Florida. And she's a great gal and does a great job as a mother and has raised 3 wonderful children.
What's her married name?
Noonan, Noonan.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit about John Marshall Law School. I think that's where you said you ended up.
I did. I was going to go to law school in Iowa and was accepted to law school in Iowa on the accelerated program. And hadn't figured out how I was going to pay for it because, you know, as I said, I was one of 8 kids. My parents were of comfortable means but not of wealthy means. And we always understood that they would cover college, but we had to cover graduate school. And so I was working on perhaps getting a scholarship, or I would work, and I worked at Iowa in a couple of different jobs after I got married. Selling clothes was one, and working at McDonald's was another one. That one I really enjoyed because I could feed all my friends, and I did. But I was, at one point, on a side note, the highest elected official in the McDonald's system in the country when I was Speaker of the House, as a former crew member. And they had my picture in almost every McDonald's in Illinois as the Speaker, but the highest elected official in the United States of America at the time. Since then, there's been a United States Senator that's been elected, and so he took my title away from me. But
With as many employees as they have, that seems almost inevitable.
true. But it was kind of fun. And so consequently, I've been pretty close to McDonald's. John Marshall Law School. As I said, I was thinking about going to school at the University of Iowa. And I had worked a summer here in Elmhurst at a department store. And the owner of the store knew that I was going to go to law school and called me up. He said, you know, why don't you go to law school in Chicago? And he said, I'll give you a job and you can work during the day. And when you got some real tough times, you can take some time off and go to night school and work for me during the day. Well, there answered the financial problem. I hadn't thought about that in terms of coming back to Chicago. So I ended up taking that job and sold clothes during the day, went to night law school, and I lasted in that position for half a year until my father said, why don't you come into a law firm and work as a law clerk during the day and go to law school at night? Now that sounded pretty darn attractive. And I thought that not only would it help me in law school, but I could be doing what I wanted to do ultimately and make sure that I wanted to make a career out of it. So I left the department store and came here in this location on the 4th floor and worked for my father starting in 1964. And worked for the law firm until I graduated in 1967, passed the bar, and then at that time I joined the firm, and many young lawyers will be paid a salary and then a percentage of the business they brought in. Well, because I had been working in Elmhurst and involved in Elmhurst, I was involved with the chamber, I was president of the Elmhurst Young Republicans, I was doing all kinds of stuff. I knew a lot of people in Elmhurst, and my practice went so well that in 6 months they made me a partner.
Wow.
Because it saved them money.
I wanted to ask you, though, my perception of going to law school, day law school, let alone night law school, is it's intense.
It is intense. I would strongly recommend, if you were to come into me as a young person in college and say, I want to go to night law school, I would question why. And I would ask you what brings that about. And I would really quiz you on solid, firm reasons for having to do that. Because if you can avoid it, I would avoid it. First of all, the problem with night law school, or night school generally, is you lose the camaraderie of what the educational experience or part of it is all about. So I never had that relationship with my fellow law students like you do when you go to day school. And you know, you've seen movies and TV shows where the young aspiring lawyers get together, have a beer, and talk about cases and stuff like that. I could never do that because I left work, I got in my car, I drove downtown to Chicago, I went to school, I got in my car, I came home, I studied until 3 or 4 in the morning almost every day. Weekends were on the books, and very little social life, no money, and a huge amount of sacrifice for everybody around you. Now, if it's the only way you can do it, which in my case was, then it works. But I would strongly suggest and urge somebody to try to avoid that if possible.
It sounds like when you got back here and got back to Elmhurst, you mentioned in this discussion that you were the, I can't remember the specific title, but basically in the head of the Young Republicans in Elmhurst.
In Elmhurst, the president, yeah.
When you were back in Iowa, were you thinking at that time, politics is something I want to get involved in?
Well, I was thinking about that. I was named after my grandfather, although our middle names are different. My dad never liked my grandfather's middle name. And so he named me Lee Albert instead of Lee Earl. But I was named after my grandfather. And so I had a somewhat of a close affinity to my grandfather's career. And in 1960, he ran for re-election and lost. And it was very painful. He lost. He was fairly ill at the time. He had had a major operation, and he really didn't recover from that. But he lost a hard-fought campaign, and
To a Democrat?
no, to a Republican in a primary, to a young Republican, 29 years old. And
Remember his name?
yeah, Lou Morgan, sure. And Lou Morgan ended up being elected to the House and served with distinction, and ended up actually being the majority leader of the House until he lost in his election to a young, aspiring politician. Sound familiar? So that was a painful experience, and I didn't really quite know what I thought about politics. And of course, when I was in college, you know, that started the Vietnam area and the Bay of Pigs. And I remember well sitting in a bar listening to John Kennedy, President Kennedy, talk about the Bay of Pigs and how we were on the brink of warfare with Russia, and how he was staring down Gorbachev, right? I remember well. And frankly,
Khrushchev, you mean?
I mean Khrushchev, I said Gorbachev, what am I thinking? Khrushchev. And I remember very firmly that we would have enlisted had the enlistment office been open, the recruiting office. Fortunately, it was at night, and we all came to our senses afterwards. I mean, you know, we were typical young college students in America, fight for America and our freedoms, and we were ready to go fight, which, as you know, a lot of 18, 19-year-olds were ready to do.
Well, you're indestructible at that age.
Oh, of course, invincible. And so obviously, and as history tells you, Khrushchev backed off, thank the good Lord. But you know, history tells us we were on the brink of major warfare, very close. So it was really a questioning time. It was really a time where not only as young people you go through identity crisis to try to figure out who you are, where you fit, what's your place in the world, and why are you here? And what is it you're going to contribute? That's a natural thing. But then you add to that something like the Bay of Pigs. You add to that, you know, the continuation of war and the problems of international relations and the growing technology and the stress of being successful. It becomes an increasingly stressful time.
Do you recall Kennedy assassination?
Very well. I was actually going to court with my dad. I was a law clerk at the time. I was in Wheaton. My dad and I were driving out to court, and he wanted to get a bite to eat. So we stopped at the Cock Robin, and in Wheaton. Cock Robin is like a McDonald's, only not as prominent, obviously. And standing in line, somebody started talking about the assassination of the president. We immediately went out to their car, got the car radio, and listened to it. Of course, you didn't have cell phones then. nor were TVs all plentiful at that time. So,
Someone who's interested, and it sounds like at that time you were interested in politics as well as the law. Does that shake you even more when the President of the United States gets assassinated?
oh, I don't think there's any question about it. I was fascinated by President Kennedy. Not only was he young, but had a great vision and great thoughts for our country. You know, history has shown us he wasn't necessarily that effective of a president. I mean, actually, Lyndon Johnson was more effective as a president, history tells us. But he was loved. And as a matter of fact, he came here to Elmhurst. I was in college, and he came to Elmhurst for a rally. Now, why would you come to Elmhurst, Illinois, the heartland of republicanism? He filled the high school stadium and had a phenomenal reception. And the people were stunned. How could this Catholic Democrat in the heart of republicanism in the country today have that kind of reception? Well, you know, he was a visionary. He was a leader. He was people were looking for, much of what they're looking for today.
How would you describe your own political leanings at that time?
Well, it was obviously more Republican, but also questioning. I mean, I was not atypical. I was atypical college student, and I had the same questioning of values and life and vision and where do I fit, what am I doing, why am I here, and what's my role in life. And so that all fit within the thing. I think you have a tendency in college, because of the nature of college, to be a little more liberal than you may turn out to be later.
So at that time you wouldn't describe yourself as a conservative necessarily?
No, I wouldn't. In fact, there's some people today that wouldn't call me a conservative either, but that's all right. So I would call myself more, without a doubt, a Republican, but also questioning values and direction.
Well, that was the age, especially a few years beyond that time frame, to do that.
When I went to the University of Iowa, it was one of the more conservative campuses in the country. In 1968, during the height of the Vietnam War, it became one of the most liberal colleges in the country. It wasn't the school that I knew.
Well, we're jumping ahead just a little bit, but what were your thoughts about Vietnam? And what were your thoughts about what was going on in the country at the time?
Well, there was great division in the country. I remember well that I could not figure out why people would mistreat our soldiers and people that served in the military. After all, some of them were there not out of choice. Some were there because they were drafted. Some were there because it was a career that they wanted to pursue. They didn't make the decision to put us into war, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. You know, it's not to jump ahead, but to use an example, you know, you could look at our war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and you and I can question that and have every right to question that, but we don't have all the facts. We don't know what has gone into that ultimate decision by our elected officials, or for that matter, our appointed chiefs of staff and so forth in our military that took us in there. And it could very well be that we would make the same decision or even a stronger decision if we knew all the facts. I could never understand why, during the course of the Vietnam War, we were persecuting the soldiers that fought for our freedom and were serving, as they had to serve in the military, a commander-in-chief. We all know who the commander-in-chief is. And we all know the hierarchical structure of the military. And a young serviceman or woman, mostly men in those days, had no choice. Why would we mistreat them when they came home? And we did. And it was wrong. And I felt very strongly about that. I lost some friends in the war in Vietnam. And
High school classmates?
high school classmates, not particularly close friends, but that I knew in high school. And one had just married his girlfriend just before he was shipped overseas and came back in a body bag. It was a sad moment. He's on the wall, the traveling wall, Vietnam. Another was a fairly prominent athlete. He came back, he was never the same, and ended up committing suicide. So every one of us has an experience like that, and we have that experiences today. It's not pretty. But if we believe in our system of government, if we believe in democracy, we have to believe in the goodness of our purpose. And if it's not there, then it's incumbent upon us to do what we can in an orderly fashion to change it within our system of laws. And I thought that we have those systems to change it. Why not change it that way instead of persecuting the people that are doing their job?
Well, it sounds like that might be one of the reasons you were intrigued by the notion of public service and running for office.
Well, it's a great theater where you can make positive changes. And that was always my goal.
Well, let's get you out of law school. When did you graduate from law
I
school then?
graduated in 1967.
And passed the bar the same year?
Passed the bar the same year, was sworn in November of 1967.
And you've already mentioned you came back here and were made a partner.
Well, I never left here.
Yeah.
You know, I was made a partner 6 months after I started practicing. I opened my shingle. I hung my shingle the day I was sworn in to practice law.
So that put us into 1968?
It put us into 1968. In this building, on the 4th floor, I started my practice. 67, 68, I made a partner because economically it was better for the partnership to make me a partner and pay me a percentage versus pay me the salary plus the percentage of my cases that I brought in. I was bringing in so much business that I was actually making more than I would make as a partner.
What kind of practice did you have initially?
All kinds, general practice. I did some criminal work, divorce work, real estate work. So a very, you know, the nature of the practice in this area at that time was general.
And that's the way you liked it?
I liked it. I liked the diversity every day.
Well, you get to this in 1968. You're here in the suburbs of Chicago. There's a lot going on in the country in 1968.
You know what was wrong with me? I never really traveled that much.
Well, I didn't mean that.
I was
that.
a homebody. I guess I liked Elmhurst.
But you're not far away from April 1968, I believe, when Martin Luther King is assassinated and Chicago is in turmoil.
Absolute turmoil.
What were you thinking at that time?
Well, what I thought was, can you believe this is happening in our country? You know, when you're not exposed to certain factors, high crime, you don't have the same concern for that as you would if you had been exposed. What do I mean by that? Obviously, we don't want anyone to suffer from high crime, but it's not as much of a crime, not as much as a concern. If you have a good school system, you're not overly concerned about good schools because you have a good school system. So I can never understand why people would commit any kind of crime, violate the law. It might be obvious because I went to law school. And so I was very disturbed by the assassination of Martin Luther King, very disturbed. I thought that our country was at a crossroads. I thought that there was that possibility that our country could be forever divided and never recover from it. Maybe I was questioning my faith. Maybe I was questioning the direction of my government. Maybe I was questioning people's basic goodness. And that's not all bad. That's okay. Because I think if you can continually question the direction of our country and people's motives, that you can progress from that.
You think you're more upset by King's assassination or what happened immediately after that assassination?
No, I was upset by the assassination, first of all. I thought King was an effective leader for the people that he wanted to represent. I'm very careful not to say his people. I'm talking about the people that he wanted to represent and the people that he spoke for. I had a number of very good friends that were black at the University of Iowa. I never had bad experience with a black person, and all my experiences with somebody of color have been very good. And at the same time, many of them have come from different backgrounds that I came from. But I think inherently people are good, and circumstances can prevent them from fulfilling some of their dreams and desires.
Get a little bit farther into 1968, then you've got Bobby Kennedy's assassination, and then you've got the Democratic Convention right here in Chicago.
Yes. Troubling times. And
did you understand what was going on in downtown Chicago at that convention center?
I was troubled by that. I was troubled by young people that would cause the kind of revolt that was taking place and the actions. I mean, throwing bags of feces into the faces of police officers, using profanities. It was not something that I completely understood. I didn't pretend to feel that I could relate to their strong feelings to cause that kind of revolt. Now, I've known a few people that took part in those revolts, and actually have an FBI file as a result of it. And I've asked them, what was on. Well, most of the time they're just young, and some really didn't totally understand what the movement was all about. And I remember at that time I was a practicing lawyer. I had just taken my oath of office to be an attorney, to uphold the laws, the Constitution of the United States and the state of Illinois. And I believed in what I was doing, and I had trouble understanding that. Then a young man called me that was a year behind me in high school, and said I was just arrested in the Chicago riots. I said, what were you arrested for? I said, I was taking pictures. And they wanted my pictures, and I refused. I said, you can pay me for them. And he came in to see me, and he said, I want you to represent me. And so the FBI called me. I understand you're representing so-and-so. I said, yeah. And they said, well, we want his photos. And I said, well, we want you to pay for them. You can come here, give me a check for them, and I'll give you the photos. He says, you don't seem to understand. He's been charged with disorderly conduct. Do you want him convicted or not? I said, excuse me? Next thing I know, they're at my office door. 2 agents. Now, if you're schooled in the law, you know when 2 agents show up at your office, that's serious stuff. Well, in spite of the fact that in 1968 I had now been practicing for close to a year, thought myself to be a seasoned veteran, scared the daylights out of me when they flashed their badge. Efren Zimbalist Jr., I think was his name. FBI. And I had never met an FBI guy before, and they were intimidating. I said, what is it you want? And he said, we want the photos. You give us the photos, we drop the charges. You don't give us the photos, we're going to convict this guy of disorderly conduct. I said, he didn't do anything. Oh, yes, he did. He was part of that riot. I said, no, he wasn't. He was taking photos. You didn't see him like we saw him. And I thought, this is not going well. I said, when do you want the photos, and how soon can we dismiss the case? So that was one of my experiences. And it shook me up a little bit, because I thought that, well, the government's not really pure in this whole thing. What's this all about?
Did you see the photos?
I saw some of them, and what they were photos of people rioting. And so the FBI wanted those so they could identify everyone in the crowd. There was about 400 of them.
400 photos?
Yeah, they were not all of them were developed. There were a lot of them on rolls.
Well, I didn't know I was going to stumble across a personal experience about that. That's fascinating. You also, I think, at this time were starting or continuing your political experiences?
Well, actually, prior to that time, I had started my political experience, because I was actually an elected precinct committeeman, I think around 1965, of York Township. I served as president of the Elmhurst Young Republicans in 1964. And in 1966, initially I was appointed to the York Township Board of Auditors, which is an elected position. And in 1968, I ran for a 4-year term, was elected, led the ballot, and served in the York Township Board of Auditors until 1972, and decided not to run again. And in the electoral world, then I ran, as you know, in 1974 for the Illinois House, was elected and started my career in the Illinois House in 1975.
Okay, the York Township Board of Auditors. Tell us a little bit about what that job entail?
Township government, so it's a township position. And township government generally deals with public assistance is their major goal, but also can deal with such things as the township roads, the maintenance of township property, and the like. It's not real big, and it has a tendency to be more important the further you go in Illinois down south. But here, it was general assistance, roads, the township roads, assessment. They assessed the property. So in York Township, assessor would assess all the property in York Township, which began to be Oak Brook and some of the larger areas, and part of their responsibility. The Board of Auditors audited the expenditures of the township to make sure that they were properly being spent. We acted as auditors.
Was this a part-time position?
Yes.
Was this a paid position?
Yes, about, I can't remember the exact amount, but like $125 a meeting. We met once a month.
Did you see this as just the way to get your foot in the door in politics?
Yeah, I did. You know, it's a good starting point. My predecessor was a guy by the name of Pate Phillip, who had dropped out of the Township Board of Auditors to run for state representative.
Did you know him well at the time?
Sure. He and his then wife were members of the Elmhurst Young Republicans.
I'm tempted to say something here. I'll go ahead and say it.
Be careful. You're on tape.
He strikes me as more mature. Was he quite a bit older than you at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When Pate ran for the Illinois House, I took his position, and when he was elected, he left the township board. I took his position on the township board. When Pate ran for the Illinois Senate, because Jack Kniffer retired, I ran for his position in the Illinois House.
Okay, this is DuPage County. Was that, I have heard this said, I don't know if it would be true for this particular time frame, but that DuPage County was the most, maybe first or second, the most solidly Republican county in the country?
It would be first or second. Orange County, California was always a rival. But yes, we were the strongest, one of the, either one or two in the country. And we've never made the same mistake twice in electing a Democrat.
So, if you want to get involved in politics, you clearly have to be Republican in the first place. Obviously, it sounds like you were comfortable to do that. But how do you make a name for yourself in Republican circles so that you are in position to get elected to some of these stepping stone positions?
It's a lot of work. It's coalition building. It's going to meetings. It's helping what I, at that time, called senior party members. I was a young Republican. Senior party members were elected officials in the regular Republican organization. I saw myself as a soldier in the system and going to meetings, becoming a precinct committeeman, working a precinct for the Republican Party, doing a good job. I ended up having one of the best precincts in the county. Getting to know the public officials, getting them comfortable with you and you with them. And I had a lot of friends that were in the senior party and a lot of friends in the young Republicans. But it's coalition building. It's the same principle that you do in business. If I want to open up an insurance agency, I'm not going to be able to walk in someone's house and say, "Hi, I'm Lee Daniels. Will you buy this insurance policy?" They're going to want to know who I am, what's my background, how much experience I have, and I delivering a good product. And it's the same in public life. They want to know who you are, what you stand for, what's your values, will you represent them, will you consider their viewpoint when you cast a vote, and how are you on spending? These are all things that people want to know, particularly in this area. And there's a tendency in this area for people to know their legislator a little bit better. Now, my experience is the further you go south, the more you know your individual legislator. So in Chicago, a lot of people have no idea who represents them. In the suburbs, a little bit more. In DuPage and the Collar counties, a little bit more. You get down to Southern Illinois, they know who their legislator is, and he's a person of the community, and he's been around for a long time, or she.
Would your grandfather's experience in the state legislature, and then the fact that he was defeated that painful defeat you talked about, is that a plus or a minus trying to get broken into Republican politics?
Well, I mean, he left me a good name. No question about it. I mean, I would go to political events with him, and he'd take me along with him and say, "This is my grandson Lee." And as I told you early on, I would work precincts for him for pay. Is that okay? And my experiences with him kind of led me to be interested in a career in politics. But I knew first and foremost I wanted to be a lawyer.
That came first.
Oh, yeah.
And
Even though I was still involved in the political world, started my public career in '66 before I graduated from law school, I still, first and foremost, wanted to be a lawyer. They always say that at the end of the day, when you're ready to get your degree, if they said, "Oh, there's one more thing, you got to cut off your right arm," that most of us wouldn't hesitate just to get that degree, because you work that hard for it. I mean, it becomes your whole life, and if you're in night school, it is your whole life.
yeah, totally consumes you, sounds like.
Totally.
We're getting into the height of the Vietnam War.
You hear the train
Yeah,
behind us?
yeah.
That's
Well-
part of our transportation hub.
Well, that's perfect sound effects for this interview, I think. Would you have considered yourself at that time a Nixon-style Republican?
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand what you mean by that. Let's deal with definitions. So by Nixon-style Republican, you're referring to?
I guess more of a moderate Republican in many respects.
I would sense that. This is generally a conservative area, but I would sense that people would call me, if you asked them, they'd probably tell you I was more of a moderate Republican. Now, if you talk to an inner city Democrat, they'd call me an arch conservative. But there's a lot of legislation that I sponsored: early intervention, circuit breaker for senior citizens, and help for the disability community, and I've told you my background on that, that are generally not perceived as Republican causes, but the causes I believed in.
More socially moderate in your own views?
Socially moderate, and, you know, fiscally, I would be more conservative.
Okay. You're just breaking into politics as I don't want to say a career, because you obviously were seeing your career as a lawyer, but what were your response to what happened to Nixon with Watergate?
I was aghast. My personal feelings were challenged a lot about government, direction of government. I couldn't believe that anybody would be that stupid, particularly the President of the United States. I knew Nixon. I met Nixon. Now, I wasn't a friend of his. I wasn't even what you'd call an acquaintance, but I met him and I campaigned for him. How could he do this? Why would he do this? What did he need to do to cause this whole thing? And why did he put a stop to it? After all, he was a very prominent attorney and very smart. Nobody ever accused Dick Nixon of not being smart. How could he get caught up on that? And it kind of would shake your foundation of beliefs in the system. And that's when what it is that really gets these people in trouble, it's the cover-up, man. Very few of these things would go very far if they just stopped it. There are people that committed a wrong. There are people that committed a burglary. Stop it right there. I'm sorry, but you did wrong. You got to suffer the consequences. Don't start covering things up, because if you do, you're going to dig yourself a deeper hole, and ultimately you're going to get caught.
Did it ever cause you to think maybe this isn't what I want to do?
Well, I think at a variety of points you start thinking that, but you know, that's okay. That's all part of the process. It makes a stronger person out of you, whether you stay or whether you leave.
Well, if I get my timeline right, this is the exact same time now you're thinking of taking that more significant step and actually running for the Illinois House.
Well, there were a lot of interplay between that time. There was a sheriff's race that I looked at, a treasurer's race I looked at, and there are a variety of races. And I was a young person at that time, 30 years old, out of law school, practicing law, had a good career going, and had a lot of opportunities. So when Pate Phillip moved up, Pate said, "You should run for the House," and I said, "Let's go." Now, I had no real knowledge of everything that the Illinois House did. I can't tell you that when I first ran in 1974 that I had a full actually 73 I started running, that I had a full comprehension of everything that a legislator did. But I knew it was kind of exciting and challenging, and you could make a difference. I knew that you could stand up on the House floor and say what you wanted to say and believe what you believed in and articulate that. And I was interested in that because I thought I had something to contribute.
I would guess, though, going into it, you would realize the tough race to win would be to get through the primary and
Right.
get the Republican nod.
That's correct.
You remember your opposition in that?
Can you imagine such a thing? Gentlemen, there were a number of people that talked about it, but at the end of the day, 2 people filed. Obviously me, and a gentleman by the name of Carl Roth, R-O-T-H, who was the mayor of Villa Park, a neighboring community. And nice guy, good family, but Carl thought that he could win the race because of his municipal experience. Municipal experience does not necessarily convert to state experience. And one of the things that with a mayor, mayors run their towns. State representatives don't run government. They're part of a team, a part of a system. And there has to be a lot different campaign style. Mayors have a tendency to feel that everyone in their town is going to vote for them, when in fact they aren't. And they generally have a tendency not to work as hard in a campaign. No one worked harder than I did. I walked door to door. I put together an organization, mainly of young people. We were excited, we were involved, we were committed. We even had a campaign song. And we even had slogans that we worked on, and we had a ball running this campaign. But we ran a strong, hard campaign and took it to the people and convinced them that I was the person that could best serve them in the office. And well, at that time you elected 3 people.
I was going to say, we need to get into description of cumulative voting.
Yes, and I love cumulative voting. Why do I love cumulative voting? History will tell you that cumulative voting best reflects the population of a district in its political and demographic views. So, where not everybody in Chicago is a Democrat, in a district you might elect 2 Democrats and 1 Republican because of cumulative voting. It is possible to elect 3 Democrats, but generally speaking, the Republicans will cast 3 votes for 1 candidate, and you'll have 2 Democrats and 1 Republican in Chicago. It's the reverse here. We elected 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And for years, it was Pate Phillip and Gene Hoffman, the Republicans, and Bill Redmond, the Democrat. Bill Redmond, the Democrat, served with my grandfather in the legislature and was very friendly with him. As a matter of fact, as I indicated, my grandfather was in ill health during the end of his career, and Bill Redmond a few times would drive him to Springfield. Now, they were political opponents in a very defined sense, but they were friends other than that. So cumulative voting meant that DuPage County, and let's talk about this district, would have 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And the views would reflect the views of the people of our district.
So the Democrat would be more of a moderate Democrat.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Pat Quinn, in his goofiness, and I think it was a mistake when we accepted not only the cutback amendment, but eliminated cumulative voting. We cut the size of the House from 177 to 118. And we cut the size of the Senate to 59, or 2 times the House. And we eliminated cumulative voting. And in doing so, you eliminated that guarantee of minority representation. So that ever since that amendment was passed in 1981?
It went up to the ballot in 1980.
1980, effective 1981. And ever since that, we have had in this area 1 Republican as our legislator. And of course, that was me. Now, I didn't object to that being the one person, but I always thought that we were better off having cumulative voting with minority representation. That meant that in the heartland of Chicago, we frequently had Republicans that were reflecting the views of the city of Chicago in our Republican caucus. Today, we only have one legislator that has parts of Chicago in his district. That's Michael McAuliffe. And he doesn't represent all of Chicago, just a little part of Chicago and then parts of the suburbs. So if you take a mathematical study of cumulative voting, you will find that it guaranteed minority representation, and it's a very sound way of electing people to office.
But isn't it a hard thing today to try to explain how it worked?
It's easy to explain. I tell you, you have 3 votes. You can vote for one person, you can vote for 2, 1.5 each, or you can give each one one vote.
Did it require that the campaigns had to do a little bit more educating to the voters out there?
Yes, and matter of fact, when I first ran, and in the general election, cumulative voting, I had made an agreement with Gene Hoffman that I would not bullet. So that what I mean by bullet is go around and vote for Lee counts for 3. That I would say people should vote for Gene Hoffman and Lee Daniels, and we campaigned together.
So there's actually you, Hoffman, and Roth all in that same Republican ticket?
That in the primary.
In the primary, right.
And you elect 2, because that's what they chose to elect. Our Democrat, our Republican representative office people decided to put up 2 people for election versus 3. And the Democrats decided to put up 1 versus 3. So that they guaranteed Bill Redmond's election, and we only went for 2 instead of 3 because we felt we couldn't elect 3. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, in the general election, the candidates standing for office were Gene Hoffman, Lee Daniels, and Bill Redmond. And
there was 3 names and 3 people would be elected.
Right,
huh?
right.
See, I thought most of the time there was 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and then
That could happen. That could happen, and it did happen. Ken Johnson was at one point with Bill Redmond, but Bill Redmond was hopping mad. He didn't want another person in there. So in the primary against, actually I was running against Gene and Carl Roth, but my preference was Gene. And I wanted to run with Gene as my running mate.
because he was an incumbent?
He was an incumbent, and he was known as an education expert. And I saw great value in that.
How did you go about financing that first campaign?
I have fundraisers. I spent, I think, if I recall correctly, I spent around $7,000, $7,500
Okay.
on that campaign. A lot of it was you know, you didn't have the photocopy machines like you have today.
Well, I'm sure $7,500 sounded like a lot of money back then.
People were surprised that I could raise money. Now today, 400,000 in a primary is not unusual. Not in this area, but in other parts of the state. So I won that campaign. I actually led the ballot, and Gene was nominated, and Bill Redmond was nominated, and went on to win the general election. In 1975, I took office, my first term in the legislature.
Okay. This might be a good time to take a quick break here.
Okay?
Elected is where we got.
Yeah, can you imagine such a thing?
Okay, we took a quick break to get some coffee and to stretch our legs. And now, Mr. Speaker, I think what I'd like to do is to finish off for today and have you talk about that initial experience down in Springfield in the state legislature.
All I did was cast a vote for speaker. When, and I could laugh about it today, but I guarantee you it was not a laughing matter at the time that it happened. You know, even though I was brought up in what you might call a political atmosphere and a political family, understanding the nature of politics through my grandfather, I still must confess that when I went to Springfield, I really didn't have a great concept of what the legislative process was all about. And I think that I didn't have an appreciation for what goes on in the back room. Now, I said I didn't have an appreciation. I believe that a lot of things that happen in the back room are not necessarily bad. It's deal making. Many people have said that the passage of laws are not pretty. It's like making a sausage. It's not pretty, but when the job is done, it's fine. And deal making requires the ability of elected officials to be able to sit down and talk candidly back and forth without worrying about somebody misquoting them or reporting them in an improper manner because they have an axe to grind or something else. They talk candidly and frankly. So when I went to Springfield, the first order of business, and prior to getting there, by the way, during the course of my campaign for the House, we knew that the Speaker was going to be a new one. The Republicans controlled the House at that time in 1974. And of course that was the Watergate year. And I'm running under the cloud of Richard Nixon's Watergate problems and resignation. There were only a few Republicans elected to office in the country in their first effort. Henry Hyde was one who was a House member and ran for Congress and was elected to Congress in that year. Pate Phillip was elected to the Senate and I was elected to the House. And that was very unusual in the country to have Republicans being elected because we went from a majority in the Illinois House to a huge minority. Remember, the Illinois House was 177 members. The result of the election of 1974 and beginning with the session in 75 had 103 Democrats and 74 Republicans. Pretty significant. Prior to that, many Republicans were running around the state that were House members saying they were running for Speaker, one of whom was Dick Walsh, highly regarded, highly respected House member, and frankly, during the time I was being courted by him to support him for Speaker, because we were going to, of course, retain control of the House. Not only did we lose control of the House, Dick Walsh lost his election. So he wasn't even going to be elected minority leader because he was no longer a member of the House. Now, so we went down there as free agents. I worked with Gene Hoffman to try to figure out who we should support. And we supported Dick Walsh's brother, Bill Walsh. Bill Walsh ran for the Republican nominee for Speaker and lost in a Republican caucus to Bud Washburn. Bud Washburn came out of Central Illinois. And one of Bud Washburn's campaign managers was a guy none other than George Ryan. And Bud Washburn was elected by the Republican caucus to be the Republican candidate for Speaker of the House. That's the exact title you're running for, although we knew we weren't going to be Speaker, we were going to be Minority Leader. All of us pledged that we would support Bud Washburn for Speaker of the House until released by Bud Washburn. That's what the rules that were passed. Nobody really focused on the rules, but you know, at the end of the day, we said, here are the rules, here's what they say, everybody for them. I opposed, no one opposed them. And the rules said that we will support Bud Washburn for as long as he's running until he were to release us, if that were to occur. So we're kind of bound by those rules. I didn't focus on them, neither did anyone else for that matter. So we go to Springfield. Our candidate's Bud Washburn. The Democrats are having one terrible time trying to figure out who their candidate for Speaker is. And an emerging candidate for Speaker was a fellow by the name of Clyde Schote, a war hero. As a matter of fact, if I could recall correctly, Clyde Schote actually received the Medal of Honor.
He did.
And was highly regarded and highly liked in Central and Southern Illinois. And some of his members in the House would have walked the hot sands for him, without a question. Clyde Schote convinced the mayor of Chicago that he had enough votes to be elected Speaker on the first ballot. Fact of the matter is, he had 36 votes. So the Democrats got into the time. Secretary of State convenes the General Assembly. Secretary of State says the first order of business after we're sworn in is the election of the Speaker. Bud Washburn's nominated by the Republicans, and the Democrats nominate a series of candidates for Speaker. I don't recall all of them, but I do know some of them. Clyde Schote was one. Bill Redmond was another. Harold Katz, Bob Mann, and a few others. If I recall correctly, somewhere around 7 candidates, don't hold me to that exact number, were nominated by the Democrats for Speaker. And they started the voting. Now, mind you, the voting is oral roll call ballot. 177 names are being called for vote. Every one of these guys and gals stood up and gave a speech. I'm for so-and-so because he's the greatest human being that's ever walked the face of the earth, and how could we exist without him? And then his colleague would get, I'm for this person, and he's the greatest person. And sometimes these speeches would go on 5 or 10 minutes.
I did want to ask a quick question here, not to interrupt you, but this is during the time that Dan Walker is governor. He's been governor for 2 years. He's had, as I understand, a terrible time with the legislature because he went in on this ticket. He was against Richard J. Daley, and Daley obviously had plenty of influence in the legislature. So I believe he tried to run his own slate of candidates in that same election that you won your first election. Wasn't too terribly successful, but I also believe he had a person in mind. He did not want Clyde Schote.
He did not want Clyde Schote. And I can't remember the exact person he had in mind, but that would be true. And he certainly didn't want Jerry Shea because Jerry Shea was Mayor Daley's floor leader. As a matter of fact, when I was interviewed by the Tribune for whether or not they'd support me for election to the House, they asked me the question, would you ever vote for Jerry Shea for Speaker? I had no idea who Jerry Shea was. And I said, who's he? Well, he's only the majority leader of the House. I said, oh, I can't see myself supporting a Democrat for Speaker. So we get into the excitement of the day, and of course we are, in my case, for the first time, we're electing a speaker, and it's my first day there. And I stand up and say, Bud Washburn, and sit down, because that's our candidate. Lo and behold, I'm watching the Democrats, and they're having just a terrible time. This goes on for 8 days. This goes on 8.5 ballots a day. And they are painful. And I'm sitting here as a freshman legislator. All I want to do is get on with my job and learn about it. Did I know that seat selection was based upon seniority and draw from a bowl? Did I know that your office selection was based upon seniority and draw from a bowl, your name? Did I know the whole system of operation in Springfield? Had no clue. The net result of my vote was I was one of the last persons to get a seat on the House and the last person to get an office and the last person to be able to select a secretary. Big deal. I'm a freshman anyhow. So having said that, we get into this, and Gene Hoffman, my running mate and my friend, and of course, at the 36th ballot, if I remember correctly, Clyde Schote, and no, actually Clyde Schote, I said, had 36 votes. He had more than that, but he did not have the necessary votes to be elected Speaker. You had to have a majority of votes plus one. And Clyde Schote could not muster enough votes because of the dissension within the party, including with Governor Walker and then some of Schote's opponents, which basically were upstate. Jerry Shea went to Schote and said, you told the mayor you had enough votes to be elected on the first ballot. You don't have enough votes to be elected on the first ballot. And the mayor's looking at someone else. Don't do that, don't do that. I guarantee you I'll be able to get the votes together. So at the 36th ballot, Mayor Daley switched his allegiance from Clyde Schote to none other than Bill Redmond. And Bill Redmond then emerges as the leading candidate for Speaker. And they start the balloting again. Bill Redmond does not get enough votes to be elected Speaker. And it goes on and on and on.
Were there people who were still had their allegiances with Schote?
Oh, absolutely. They would have died for him. And I think the number is around 8. But enough members with the other dissenting votes to cause Bill Redmond not to have enough votes to be elected Speaker. So this becomes a very painful process because we're all basically Republicans are doing. Every time they call a Republican, they go Bud Washburn, or we may get mad and give, you guys can't even organize your own house. Why don't you just elect Bud Washburn and we can get on with our business? Of course, they all laugh. What I didn't know was during this whole time in the back rooms, they were trying to figure out how we get out of this mess. Well, of course, I wasn't included there. What did I know? And of course, they were starting negotiation with the Democrats. What if we elected a Republican? What if Clyde Schote threw his support to Bud Washburn? What would we do on committee assignments, office assignments, bills, and the hearing of bills, and how we do divide the power? And then the other was equally true. Why don't Republicans get enough vote to elect Clyde Schote? At about the 76th ballot, I walked over to Gene Hoffman's office. I said, I can't take this anymore. This is BS. And Hoffman said, I agree with you. This is miserable. Now, he had been there for like 6 terms. And not 6 terms. He'd been there like 3 terms, 4 terms. And he said, I agree with you. This is terrible. I said, you know, Gene, I'm actually thinking about voting for Redmond. And Gene says, you got to be kidding. I said, no. I said, I didn't come down here to be spending time trying to elect a Speaker of the House. When they have a qualified candidate, Bill Redmond, and they can't get their act together, why don't we just help them? He said, that's interesting. So the next day, both Gene and I went over and sat with Bill Redmond, and Bill said, what can I do for you? And I said to Bill Redmond, I'm thinking about voting for you for Speaker. He looked at me, he says, do you know what you're doing? I said, I'm not sure. He says, maybe you ought to think about it. What did I know? Did I ask for anything? No. Did I want anything from him? Only to be a good speaker and to treat people fairly. Did I know about committee assignments, office assignments, secretary assignments? Had no idea. Well, in the 96th ballot, well, let me back up a little bit. I then went into Bud Washburn's office, said, Bud, I'm not going to sit here day in and day out and listen to this stuff. And I'm telling you, when it comes to the 96th ballot, if this isn't decided, I'm voting for Bill Redmond. Do you know what you're doing? You're breaking the rules. You said that you took an oath to go along with our rules. I said, you know, yeah, I said I'd go along with that, but I wasn't giving anyone carte blanche to run my life or the life of the people that I represent. And I intend thoroughly to exercise my right to vote for the candidate of my choice. If you guys can't get your act together, and if you can't do what you need to do to work a deal with the Democrats to elect somebody, what's wrong with Redmond? He said, nothing. I said, well, go make a deal. Do what you got to do.
Quick question. From your previous comment, though, it sounded like the Republican rank and file would have been more comfortable with Schote.
A lot of downstaters. A lot of us had no clue, but you know, Schote was a very popular guy. He was a backslapping kind of very popular, without a doubt, a very distinguished service career, very popular downstate. Downstaters outside of Chicago had a tendency to like Schote. And Bud Washburn and George Ryan probably, I don't know this for a fact, but probably would have been comfortable with Schote. Whereas Bill Redmond was almost, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, a backbencher. He was a quiet guy. After all, he was a model for Sun-Made Raisins. And he was a wrestler. And at one point, you remember, challenged Jim Thompson to a basketball tournament and said he could beat Jim in basketball. And he did. Made more baskets than Jim Thompson. So Bill Redmond, in my opinion, was a safe choice because he was not going to run roughshod over the Republicans, as Schote would have. Why don't you, Bud, make a deal and just get this over with? Well, we're working on it. So now we're about 80 ballots. I said, I'm very serious, by the way. He said, well, don't do anything yet. I said, I'm not doing anything. I told you when I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it on the 96th ballot. And he said, well, just think about it. So I went back and forth. Finally, it came time, and I said, Bud, I'm doing the next vote. Well, there's a guy sitting next to me all this time by the name of Charlie Fleck, who later became a judge. And Charlie Fleck said to me, I heard that you're thinking about voting for Redmond in the next ballot. I said, yeah. He said, you sure you want to do this? I said, no, but this is ridiculous. It's time to get on with our business and get this stuff going.
Fleck is a Republican.
Fleck's a Republican. He says, well, all right, I understand. You'll be okay. So, I believe it was a Thursday. They called my name. I stood up, and by this time, everyone had an idea what I was going to do. And they said, who do you vote for? I said, Mr. Speaker, it's time that we get on with the people's business. I vote for Bill Redmond. The place went up for grabs. You would have thought that I'd pulled a gun and aimed it at every member of the House. The Democrats jumped up out of their chairs. Some standing on desks called me every name in the book, and the Secretary of State immediately adjourned the House before they recognized my vote. I'm standing there dumbfounded. I have no clue what really just happened, except for, in reality, they did not recognize my vote. They adjourned the House until the following week.
How could they not recognize your vote when you just made your vote?
Because they have to call it into the record. The Secretary of State has to say, Daniels votes for Washburn. Daniels votes for Redmond. They didn't do that. Adjourned the House immediately. Well, I walk out of the chamber, and by that time we were being covered by national news. And national news had hit one of the Democrats, not hit, but had covered one of the Democrats, Tommy Hanahan, who was from the suburbs of Chicago, a union worker, a carpenter by trade, who said, that Daniels won't pass gas around here. He's through. Some of my own members, I remember one time I was in the washroom, walking into the washroom, and one guy was in midstream. And he said, oh my God, and he stopped, zipped himself up, and walked out of the place. He said, I'm not taking a leak around you. You belong in a closet with the brooms. He told me what I could do with the broom, too. It was pretty rough. And so I was a little bit shell-shocked. So Hoffman comes up and he says, we better get out of here. And we immediately got in our cars and drove home. I rode down with Hoffman. And drove
home to Elmhurst.
Elmhurst, the land of Oz, the safe haven, the mother's womb, the comfort of all. My town of Elmhurst. Stay away from all these bad people. I was getting calls from the state party chairman, Doc Adams. You can't do this. This is the wrong thing. You're ruining your career. The papers had quotes in from Democrats and Republicans that I don't know what I'm doing and this is the silliest thing. However, I got over 400 telegrams and letters saying, right on, this is the right thing to do. And my constituency, because I came from this area, and because so did Bill Redmond, supported me strongly in the efforts. So in spite of the effort, calls from Bud Washburn, George Ryan, Doc Adams, the state party chairman, in spite of that, I had huge support back home. And I said, that's it. I gave you all plenty of opportunity. I'm voting for Redmond. Go back to Springfield. They convened the House. Daniels, how do you vote? Because they hadn't recorded it. I made my little speech and voted for Redmond. And of course, there were boos and so forth. And Charlie Fleck waves to the secretary. Yes, Mr. Fleck, what is it? I want to say something. And he called me every name in the book, a snake in the grass, the lowest level of person in the world, and really a rotten individual, can't be trusted, and should be ridden out of Springfield on a rail, tarred and feathered. Sits down, and I look at him, I said, Charlie. He said, don't worry, it's all talk. And frankly, I wanted to shoot him. Welcome to state politics. Well, as you might guess, they refused to settle the matter right away because they wanted to show me. And Gene Hoffman followed. Gene Hoffman voted. And another legislator followed.
That same vote?
The same vote, the same ballot.
Okay.
But there weren't enough to elect Redmond, just short of the required number of votes, 89.
Now, did Hoffman and this other Republican who broke ranks, were they vilified as well, or did they keep their attention on you?
They pretty much heaped it on me, although people did say to Hoffman, you know better. You said you should have told him. Well, on the 103rd ballot, finally there were enough crossover votes. They put together enough votes to elect Redmond Speaker of the House. But I broke the ranks. I took the heat. I did what I thought was right, and to this day I would have done it again. Although I must confess, I had no idea of the consequences. Now, what saved me in my career? I asked for nothing. I made no deal. I didn't cut any partisan deal. I didn't get a committee chairmanship or any special assignments. I didn't get a special office. I didn't get a special seat on the House floor. I took my hit and lived with it. And members saw that, and they knew that I was as green a freshman as anybody that went down there. I had no idea how the system worked. Secondly, what also saved me was at the very time I was telling them I'm going to vote for Redmond, they were trying to figure out how to get somebody to vote for Redmond, and I walk in the office and tell them, and they had a party after I left, the very first time. This is perfect. A freshman legislator from Bill Redmond's district that has no clue. How could we ask for anything perfect? And they orchestrated the whole response to make it look like this was a bad thing. But in essence, they liked it. So, as you look at my career, and even though I was told by people that the career was over, there were certain factors that prohibited that from happening, such as not making a deal, clearly a friend of Bill Redmond's, and I said, Bill Redmond was a friend of my grandfather and treated him kindly when he was ill, and you don't forget things like that. And clearly not part of an overall scheme or deal to favor yourself individually.
This is again the second half of Dan Walker's one term as governor, and as I recall, not much got accomplished because he didn't have much sway over the Democrats in the legislature, let alone the Republicans.
Oh, all we did was watch the Democrats chop them apart in my first term, and I was amused by that, in the sense that why does a guy let this happen to him, or how does he let it happen to him? He's just a very smart man, but he just in the political world, he ran as an independent. He thought he was an independent, and he tried to run the state as an independent. You can't do it. You've got to have some kind of system and support in the political world and in order to make the state work. Pat Quinn is finding out the same thing. Pat Quinn has always run against government. Now he's trying to run government. He doesn't have the clue on the art of governance and what it takes to be a good governor for all of us.
In talking to some people and getting ready for this, I heard a story, and you can verify this or deny this one.
It's not true.
Something about a state police officer stopping you on the way back to Elmhurst?
Gene Hoffman and I got in our car after I cast that initial vote, and they adjourned the House. Gene Hoffman said, "We better get out of here." I had driven down. It was my car. And we were going through just past Dwight, Illinois, going north. And I know I was going around 90 miles an hour. I could hardly wait to get home to the motherland. And sure enough, out of the dark comes a police officer, pulls us over, and says, "Let me see your license." I showed him my license. He said, "Lee Daniels." "Why do I know your name?" I said, I don't know. He says, no, I know your name for some reason. And I'm thinking, he probably thinks I'm a criminal or something. I said, "No, I don't." He said, "You're the guy that voted for Redmond. You better get out of here. They're after you." And sent me on my way. He didn't want to delay me because he knew they were after me.
Well, I think that's a good way to finish up this story, quite frankly. Okay. What committee assignments did you end up with?
Motor vehicles, judiciary, 1 and 2. The judiciary was civil judiciary and criminal judiciary, and motor vehicles, and I think I had one more. I can't remember the other one.
I think the Blue Book mentioned those three. I didn't see any other ones.
Yeah, it might have been it at the time because we had more members.
Wouldn't a judiciary committee be one that you would have wanted in the first place?
Yeah, it would have. And interesting enough, guess who the chairman of the Civil Judiciary Committee was? None other than Harold Washington,
Oh.
who I became very good friends with. And then he's elected mayor of Chicago, and guess who could call up Harold Washington and get an appointment?
Well,
Harold Washington, and in the end, supported Bill Redmond. So Bill Redmond made him chairman of the Judiciary Committee, in spite of the fact that Harold Washington and I shared the same birthday, April 15th, but he had gone to jail because he failed to file his tax returns.
another interesting twist in Illinois politics.
Yeah.
I think this is probably a good place for us to break tonight here, Mr. Speaker, but this is especially this last session here, and I was really looking forward to hearing this anyway, but it's been fun to hear this from your perspective.
Well, it was an interesting time, and all I can say is that it probably took a freshman legislator from Bill Redmond's district to break that logjam in the way that it was done, and it was done in a pure way. There weren't any deals that were being cut because he didn't need to cut the deals, because a freshman legislator that didn't know what he was doing decided that it was time to get it over with.
That's still quite a baptism in Springfield politics.
It was a huge baptism in Springfield politics.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.